pleasure to see such a wonderful crowd here tonight. It illustrates a lot of interest in international trade and hopefully a lot of interest in TPP. It's nice to be back in Japan too. As Mr. Hanyu said, it would be good if we could achieve trade liberalization on a multilateral basis through the World Trade Organization. That's what many of us were hoping for. Glenn Fukushima is sitting here in the front row. He worked for me at USTR when we were in the middle of the Uruguay round of trade negotiations. There were about 100 countries sitting around the table at that time, and we were able to get that exercise launched, as Glenn will remember, and later on it was brought to a successful conclusion. It took 8 years, which was longer than we had hoped, but at least it got to a conclusion. More recently, the World Trade Organization has had the Doha negotiations, as Mr. Hanyu indicated. But unfortunately, those negotiations have been going around in circles for more than a decade now, and thus far have produced no work product of any kind. And that's what TPP is all about. It's clearly what many people would say is the only act in town these days, the only thing worthwhile happening in trade negotiations. It's probably the best act in town. There are other negotiations underway around the world, but in my judgment there is nothing that elsewhere in the world that has the potential of TPP. My first point would be that in economic terms, and obviously there are political and geopolitical considerations involved too, but in economic terms, it's a no-brainer for Japan. By that I mean the benefits will be very, very substantial. And for that reason alone, I would think that Japan would want to use TPP as a basis to jumpstart the economy, an economy that has been somewhat in the doldrums over the last 20 years. And in my judgment, TPP would do an excellent job of providing that jump start. And that's probably the most important reason of all. And the reason I'm so confident about that with respect to Japan is that I relate back to what has happened in what we call NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement, which we began during my tenure as USTR. We negotiated the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement when I was Trade Minister, and then later Mexico was added to create what is now NAFTA. My second reason for believing Japan ought to join TPP is because the neighbors are either there or they're going to be there. And as all of you know, free trade agreements are inherently discriminatory. They benefit those who are on the inside. They're not so good for people who are on the outside. Right now, Japan is on the outside. There are a number of Asian countries who are in, with relatively new participants being Malaysia and Vietnam. Singapore was there before, and in time, in my judgment, there will be additional Asian countries. The Philippines has already expressed an interest. so has Thailand, so has Taiwan. And in time, maybe not in the initial, what I call tranche of negotiations, but maybe in a second tranche of negotiations, those countries will be there. And they will all have an advantage over Japan if Japan is not a participant. But also in the neighborhood are Korea and China. And the question is, how will Japan line up against those two big gorillas? And will those gorillas be in TPP? The other point I would make is that TPP could provide Japan with opportunities to reform segments of its economy that merit reform. But the same argument can probably be made for other segments of your economy. And being an agriculturalist, I know full well that your agricultural community is not enthused about Japan's potential participation in TPP. But in my judgment, something that is in the long-term best interest of Japan as a country, and TPP clearly is something that should be embraced by all of the Japanese public and Japanese business enterprises. Let me switch to the other side then and talk for just a little bit about why I think the other participating nations in TPP ought to welcome Japan. As you probably know, most of the participating nations have said okay to Japan. The U.S. has not yet said okay. The first one is that in economic terms, it'll make it a meaningful negotiation for the other participants. Not only will it be meaningful for Japan to come in and have the benefit of additional trade liberalization into the U.S. market, for example, but obviously if Japan's in, the U.S. and the other countries will have an opportunity to sell in a very significant Japanese market, and that's very attractive to all of them. There's no question that will make it a meaningful trade negotiation, because your economy is about twice the size of all the other economies in TPP, with the exception of the United States. If you add everybody else together, their GDP would total to about half what Japan's TPP is. So if Japan comes in, it'll be a winner, and people should invite Japan. Japan may never come into TPP, and that would be a real loss for the rest of the countries as well as for Japan. And then the other argument I would make is what I call the balance wheel argument, where Japan plays a rather special role in these trade and economic areas. Japan can be a balance wheel between Asia and Europe, for example. It can be a balance wheel between China and the U.S. You're kind of situated in economic terms, geopolitical terms, in a good location to make sure that this all fits together in a sensible way. And that's important to all of us, including to Japan itself. And then finally, I would say another reason for inviting Japan in is because your negotiating team is ready to go. they can hit the ground running, which is not true of a lot of other countries. So that's the final reason. Any of these sensitive industries will be excluded from the negotiations. Rice was excluded in the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, so your rice farmers say, why not in TPP? The Canadians have very protectionist dairy and poultry programs, and of course they're saying same thing. If you can exclude rice with Korea, and if you can say to Australia, no more Australian sugar coming into the U.S., then we should be able to maintain our protectionist programs in dairy and poultry. Well, the U.S. should never have set some of these bad precedents. As USTR, as Glenn may remember, I never, ever agreed to exclude anything from any negotiation. And that's the way it should be done. And I believe that finally the U.S. administration is beginning to understand that that's a wise course of action. So what the U.S. should say to all of these countries, and what the U.S. should do to itself, is say, no exclusions, none. We will deal with these difficult issues in a sensible, rational way in the negotiations, but we will not exclude anything. And I believe that that's the way it will turn out in TPP. But at any rate, we need to get this done. And my conclusion is that there are a lot of good reasons why Japan should want to be in, should be an insider rather than an outsider. And there are a lot of good reasons why the present nations should want to have Japan to come in. And I hope those reasons will prevail. Good questions. So I can see China joining TPP X years down the road, but not as a bolt-on. In other words, China is not about to accept everything that's there any more than Japan is. It's going to want to have a full-scale negotiation, if you call it that, if and when it were to join TPP. That's just the geopolitical reality, and that's okay. I don't think you do a full-scale negotiation for a lot of other countries in Asia or on our side of the Pacific. You do get a bunch of bolt-ons. Countries that will accept what is there, maybe verbatim, or if not verbatim, with nominal or minimal negotiations. But China, being the 600-pound gorilla, is not going to accept that. So that's the first point. But that's a number of years down the road. Okay, I would go back to the comments I made about NAFTA and what has happened with the explosion of trade that took place between the U.S. and Canada and the U.S. and Mexico. And explosion is really the right word. If TPP would provide for that kind of explosion in Japan with a very substantial increase in trade with the other TPP nations, that's going to, it may not generate a whole lot of jobs, because job creation is difficult to predict, but it's going to generate revenue in the private sector of Japan, and it's going to generate profits, and it's going to generate tax revenues for the Japanese government. And so the benefits to that part of Japan will come indirectly, if you will. Now, I can't
say to what degree the Japanese government will take some of those additional tax revenues and invest them in that part of Japan. That's a decision of your government, of course, not my decision. But the additional revenues are going to be there.